Hello, students. I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Chapter 6, which covers culturally competent research. In this video lecture, we will cover the following topics: cultural competency in research versus practice context, 4 key features of culturally competent research, general strategies for developing cultural competency in research, Malais's 8 criteria for culturally competent scholarship, a research methodology for fostering cultural competency in research. We will specifically discuss community-based participatory research. And finally, issues in research related to data governance, data justice, and decolonizing data. By the end of this video lecture, you should be able to understand and explain the following: the meaning of cultural competency in research versus practice context, the 4 key features of culturally competent research, general strategies for developing cultural competency in research, Malais's 8 criteria for culturally competent scholarship, how community-based participatory research can be used to foster cultural competency in research, and finally, issues of data governance, data justice, and decolonizing data. So we are still in Unit 2, and in the last video lecture, we discussed Chapter 5. In this video lecture, we will discuss Chapter 6, which again is related to culturally competent research. So let's begin by discussing the meaning of cultural competency as it is applied to research in comparison to practice contexts. So in practice context, cultural competence refers to the processes by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to all people. However, the meaning of cultural context differs when we think about research context. So in a research context, cultural competence means being aware of the ways in which cultural factors and cultural differences can influence all stages of the research process, including what we investigate, how we investigate it, and how we analyze and interpret our findings. So now let's talk about 4 key features of culturally competent research. So the 4 key features that we'll discuss include research participants, measurement, data analysis and interpretation, and finally, acculturation. So let's begin by discussing research participants. So as it relates to research participants, we will discuss what I call the 3 R's, which is representation, recruitment, and retention. So let's begin by discussing representation. So researchers should attempt to include a sufficient and representative number of research participants from minority and oppressed populations. Researchers should also learn how to maximize the likelihood of obtaining their participation. Studies that do not include an adequate representation from minority and oppressed populations, no matter how rigorously designed, are not generalizable to those populations. And this is a very important point, is that when we look at the sample demographics that are included in any given study, if certain minority and oppressed populations are excluded or are not included for some reason, then we have to think about the limitations of the generalizations that we make. Because if those groups are not included in our research study, then we cannot make any generalizations about those populations. So if minority groups are underrepresented in studies evaluating the effectiveness of interventions, how do we know whether they would benefit from those interventions? So this is a big problem that we have in the research community, is that oftentimes, particularly as it relates to intervention studies, we oftentimes struggle to recruit minority and oppressed populations into intervention research studies. And this becomes a problem because when we want to understand the effectiveness of interventions, if those groups are not included, we can't speak to the extent to which they benefit from those interventions. So we really need representation of every racial ethnic group in intervention studies so that we can understand how interventions work for different populations. What may work for one racial or ethnic minority group may not work for another. And so it's important to have that representation. And when we don't have it, then we have to be really careful about how we generalize. Failing to include minority and underrepresented groups in local, federal, and state research and data collection efforts also impacts our ability to create sound and socially just policies. Quality data is necessary for making evidence-based, socially just decisions. So oftentimes, many of the social policies that impact minority and oppressed populations were created based on data collection efforts in which they were not included. So how can we make or create rather the most sound and socially just policies when oftentimes certain groups are excluded from the very data collection efforts that inform the development of policy? So we really need quality data in order to make the most evidence-based and socially just decisions. And again, this is challenged by current US systems of data collection and reporting that tend to disproportionately exclude marginalized groups, in particular American Indian and Alaska Natives. So we know that this is a particular group that's oftentimes not very well represented in the US systems of data collection that we currently have in place. So the way in which we go about collecting data currently in the US often disproportionately excludes certain populations. And so this is a challenge because we don't have that representation from certain groups. It's very easy to create misguided policies. It ends up, this is what the end result typically is when we don't have the appropriate representation, is it ends up, we end up with very misguided policies, which is a really big problem here in the US. And so here's a report that I pulled from the Urban Indian Health Institute, and this is a very recent report. And I like to go outside of the text a bit from time to time to give you a little bit more than what is in your text. And so I think that this report here is a very timely and relevant report given what we are experiencing in the pandemic. And so the title of the report is "The Genocide of American Indians and Alaska Natives and COVID-19 Data." And it's a report card that grades the US states' quality of COVID-19 racial data and their effectiveness in collecting and reporting data on American Indian and Alaska Native populations. And so one of the things that is mentioned in this report is it really talks about some of the implications of the systematic exclusion of these populations or these communities from research and data collection efforts. And so one of the things that's mentioned is that the lack of quality data continues to misrepresent and obscure the burden of disease among American Indian and Alaska Natives and other peoples of color. And health disparities can widen as a result of misinformed, data-driven policies and programs, in addition to inadequate resource allocation. Several of the health implications of poor racial data include underestimation of the true severity of morbidity and mortality, inadequate public health programs and activities that are non-responsive to American Indian and Alaska Native communities, an equitable allocation of resources for disproportionately impacted communities, incorrect and limited understanding of racial health disparities, and perpetuation of health disparities due to misinformed policies, programs, and insufficient resource allocation. So as I mentioned previously, when we don't have complete and adequate data, then we end up with misinformed policies and programs, and we also end up with an insufficient amount of resource allocation. Certain groups, so we oftentimes the federal government as well as state and local government rely on data in order to help them make decisions about how to allocate certain resources. And if certain groups are excluded from the data collection process, then this means that essentially we end up being non-responsive to the needs of certain communities. And so that's essentially what this particular report talks about. And it's just something that I wanted to bring to your attention so that you can kind of think about the far-reaching impact of exclusion, the systematic exclusion of certain communities from data collection efforts within the US. And so here at the bottom, one of the quotes that I like from this report is by Abigail Echo Hawk, which she is the in leadership at the Urban Indian Health Institute. And we'll talk more about her work toward the end of this lecture. But A quote from her says, "Equity will not be achieved in COVID-19 response or vaccinations until public health surveillance systems properly collect and report race and ethnicity." And so again, it's just important to think about this as we think about data and we think about research and we think about who is included from certain research studies or data collections and who is excluded. Because oftentimes when we look at the demographics in certain studies, we only think about who was included, but we don't ask ourselves the question, who was excluded, and what might that mean for our understanding of that particular population. And so there are implications for excluding certain groups that we need to think about as well. So recruiting and retaining a representative sample of research participants from minority and oppressed populations is often a challenge in research. This is especially true in intervention research. And here are a couple of the reasons why it's difficult to recruit certain groups. There's a lack of trust. There's a lack of reciprocation, a lack of perceived value of the research, and cultural insensitivity. So as we talked about in the last video, when we talked about ethics, we know that certain groups of individuals have been mistreated in the research process. And so as a result of this, there has been a lack of trust developed with certain groups toward the research process. And those groups, namely, are African Americans and Native Americans. These are two groups that have been severely mistreated in the name of research. And so as a result of this, it is more of a struggle to recruit these groups into research studies, in particular intervention research. In addition, oftentimes, minority and oppressed populations perceive researchers as sort of coming into their communities and taking, right, or collecting data without reciprocating or without leaving anything that would be of benefit to the community. And so this is another reason why oftentimes certain groups are very hesitant to take part in the research process, is because there's a lack of reciprocation. And in addition, oftentimes as researchers, there's a power dynamic, right? And so as researchers, we often come into the community with our research questions and our surveys and our preconceived notions about what we think is going to happen based on some theoretical framework. And this in turn translates into a lack of value, for at least a perceived lack of value for the research. So even though we might know the value, because community members had no voice or no say in how that study was conceptualized or how those measurement tools were selected or how research questions were formulated, if we leave the community out of the process, then there will be a greater likelihood of community members perceiving that the research being produced does not have value for them because their voice was not their voice was not heard, or their voices were not heard in the process of developing the research project. And in addition, cultural insensitivity. So oftentimes when we, especially if we're not a member of the cultural group that we're studying, if we don't seek the voices and opinions of those who are a part of the cultural group, then sometimes what we are proposing to do in our research studies can come across sometimes as culturally insensitive, because we lack the cultural knowledge to develop projects that are meaningful to certain cultures and certain racial ethnic groups. And so there are some ways in which we can improve upon these things. And there are some strategies that we'll talk about momentarily that can help us to increase our efforts of, or improve our efforts of recruitment and retention in research studies. Just seeking representation of minorities in research doesn't guarantee it will happen. Successfully recruiting and retaining members of minority and oppressed populations requires special culturally sensitive knowledge and efforts. So as I just mentioned, it's not enough to just seek representation of minorities. We have to, in order to recruit and retain. So it's not just about recruitment of minority and oppressed participants in research studies. It's also about retention. And retention is particularly an issue in intervention research because oftentimes in interventions run over the course of let's just say some interventions are longer than others, but they're typically more longitudinal in nature, meaning that we're studying this intervention over time. It's not sort of a one-shot kind of study where we go in and collect survey data and we're done. When we're talking about intervention research, interventions can be 8 weeks, they can be a year long, they can be 12 weeks. Interventions vary in terms of the duration of time. But regardless of the amount of time, the idea with intervention research is that interventions run over a period of time. And so we're not only recruiting minority and oppressed populations into interventions, but we need to figure out ways to retain them as well. And so the retention piece is typically what researchers struggle with the most. Recruitment can be challenging for certain populations, but retention can be even more challenging, especially if we don't have the specialized culturally sensitive knowledge and skills that are required. It also requires being responsive to the concerns of minority and oppressed communities in the way research problems are formulated. So as I mentioned previously, if we don't involve community members from the beginning, in the beginning stages of the research process, when we're formulating when we're thinking about the problem that we want to study and we're formulating research questions, these are all things that we do in the early phases of the research process. And so if we want to maximize the cultural competency of our studies, and if we want to be truly culturally competent in our approach to research, then it does require being responsive to the concerns and needs of the community and involving them from the very early stages of the process. Insensitivity to these concerns can lead to problems in recruitment and retention and findings that are not relevant to the needs perceived by members of those communities. So again, if we don't involve community members and we're not designing our studies in such a way that is meaningful to members of the community that we're seeking to study, then it's more likely that we will have problems with recruiting and retaining those communities. And ultimately, when we don't seek the voices of community members, we can end up producing findings that are just not relevant to their needs. And this really reminds me of, I took a trip a couple of years ago to South America, to Colombia specifically. And I remember speaking with community members there, and I went in and I did this whole presentation on father involvement and why that's important in the US context, and how fathers are becoming more involved in the lives of their children. And I really thought that the individuals that I was speaking to would really grasp this idea. They would really take hold of it and be interested in collaborating on research with me. And I realized that, as I sat there and I presented and I kind of observed some of the body language of the members of the individuals in the room, I realized that they were not as interested in what I was saying as I thought that they would be. And the reason for that, I later learned, is because individuals in South America, in Colombia, the members of the community that I was speaking to, they really come from more of a matriarchal society. And they really see the role of fathers very differently than we do here in the US, in the US. And one of the individuals that I spoke to afterwards pretty much informed me that, in Colombia, they kind of see the role of fathers, or rather, I'm trying to remember how they put it. Pretty much when fathers involve themselves with children, it can be seen as sort of overstepping. Because they're a matriarchal society, fathers are expected to have a lesser role than mothers in terms of rearing children. And not only that, but oftentimes fathers would have to go out for work. They would have to travel far from their residence to seek work and to go to work each day. And so it's not that fathers did not want to be involved in the lives of their children, but the way in which their society is structured is just different than it is here in the US. There's more of an emphasis put on the role of the mother in rearing children. And not only that, but I had to stop myself and say, and I asked them, I said, what is it, if we were to partner in research, what are the needs of your community? What is it that you feel your community needs? If you could ask any question about what's happening in your community, what would it be? And at that particular time, there were many militant groups that were sort of at war with the government at the time. And there were several different militia groups that had formed, and there was a lot of conflict in the country at the time. And that conflict really ravished families, and it was many individuals died as a result in crossfires between these groups and the government. And so what they really wanted to understand was how families were being impacted by the violence. And that's not even a thought that I even had, but it was so eye-opening to me because it allowed me to see that it really wasn't about my preconceived notions about what I thought was important, but it was really about understanding from their view and their perspective what they felt was important and what they wanted to know. And so that was such a learning opportunity for me, and such a moment where I really had to step back and think about how I approach research. And so I just wanted to share that in terms of really honing in on the importance of understanding that we need to go into the community when we do research with our eyes open, our eyes and our ears open to learn and understand problems from the perspective of the community. So in terms of overcoming barriers to recruitment and retention, several strategies have been offered in the literature to overcome barriers to recruitment and retention of minority and oppressed populations in research. Not all strategies have been empirically tested. They are viewed more as practice wisdom than evidence-based procedures. So the strategies that are shared in your book have not necessarily been empirically tested. So I just wanted to put that out there, is that it is mentioned in your text that there are many strategies that are offered, and however, there's not much of an evidence base to suggest that they work per se. So these are just more strategies that are offered based on the practice wisdom of the individuals who wrote your text. And these are just some strategies that they are offering that could potentially be helpful in overcoming some of the barriers that we can experience in the process of trying to recruit and retain minority and oppressed populations in research. So here are some of the strategies, and I won't read through all of them, but just take a look at them and try to get sort of an understanding of some of the things that we can do as researchers to try to improve upon this issue of recruitment and retention. So some of the things, I'll just read through some of them. Some of the things that we can do as researchers to help in this area is to obtain endorsement from community leaders. So this is one of the things that I had to do when I went into a lot of my research that I done when I was living in the Washington, D.C. area. A lot of the work that I had done with fathers was done in the Baltimore area. And so one of the first things that I had to do was go to the leaders of the agencies that I was seeking to collect data from. And I had to get their permission. I had to get their endorsement of my project. And I had to really sit down and understand from them what was needed in order to allow me to be the most successful at recruiting and retaining participants. Also, we want to be sure to use culturally sensitive approaches regarding confidentiality. So here again, the population that I was studying at that time, confidentiality was a big issue because, as I mentioned in the last video lecture, some of the fathers that I was studying had child support arrears. In other words, back child support that they had not paid. And so that was an issue for many of them. Some of them were in the court system and involved in different systems they were involved in different systems within the courts for various different reasons, whether it was due to child support payments or family court or whatever it was. They had some involvement with the courts. And so offering my participants confidentiality and ensuring confidentiality was a big deal, and something that I really had to make sure that I did. Also, providing adequate compensation. So we want to make sure that we are adequately compensating our participants, but at the same time, there's a fine line. So we don't want to coerce anyone into participating in our research studies. So we do want to compensate and provide adequate compensation, but we also don't want to coerce. And so even in thinking back to my own work, I sought out I did consult with the community leaders about how much the compensation should be, because I didn't want to cross over into coercion. And so I wanted to, they have a better understanding of the population than I do. And so I really sought their expertise and their input on how much of an incentive I should offer. You also want to choose a sensitive and accessible setting. So when I was in the field collecting data, the setting that I used was the office of the agencies that I was working with. So I had made agreements with those agencies to allow me a space within their building that I could use for data collection. And so this was a setting that my participants were familiar with. And so I didn't ask them to meet me somewhere randomly in the community that they, may have been very unfamiliar with. I asked them to meet me somewhere that they frequented, right? So they knew where the agency was and they knew how to get there, and they had transportation and all that kind of thing. So, so it made it easy for them. And so we have to consider the setting that we choose as well, because we want to make sure that it's accessible as possible. And also, if we're asking, if we're running an intervention and individuals are having to come, let's just say on a weekly basis, to take part in the intervention, that's another reason why we need to be sure that where we are conducting our study is accessible, especially if the study is taking place over a long period of time. And so these are just some of the things to think about. And as I mentioned, I won't read through all of them, but I do want you to be familiar with some of the key strategies and ways in which we can do our due diligence to be as culturally competent as possible in order to improve recruitment and retention. Because as I mentioned, this is very important, because if certain groups are not included in our studies, then that means that we can't speak to their experiences. We can't speak to the extent to which they benefit from a particular intervention at all. We can't make any generalizations to these populations if they're not included. And so we really have to do our due diligence to try to put in place some strategies that can help us to increase the chances of recruitment and retention for these understudied groups. Now let's talk about measurement. Researchers should use measurement procedures that have been shown to be reliable and valid for the minority and oppressed populations participating in this study. And so we'll talk about, when we get to chapter 9, which is on measurement, we'll talk about reliability and validity. But it's very important that we ensure that the measurement tools that we're using in our studies are reliable and valid, and not just reliable and valid, but appropriate for use with the minority and oppressed populations that are taking part in our study. If we use measurement outcomes with instruments that are not reliable or valid for minority or oppressed populations, we may yield misleading findings. Pilot testing instruments with the sample and reestablishing reliability and validity is highly important. So in other words, it does no good if the way in which our measurement tools are structured, if they're structured in such a way that the populations that we're studying can't understand them or are misinterpreting what is being asked of them, then that means that any result that we yield from those tools can be misleading or just flat out incorrect. So it's very important to pilot test the instrument. And what pilot testing means is that we administer the measurement tools that we are seeking to use with a small sample that's very similar to the population that we're wanting to study, but not exactly the same, but very similar. And so we pilot test it, meaning that we give it a test run. And what we do in that pilot testing is we ask individuals that are helping us to kind of get the kinks out of the measurement tools. We're asking questions like, do these items make sense? Is the wording clear? So we're really trying to test it out to just ensure that when we administer it with the population that we actually want to study, that it is less likely that they will misinterpret the measurement tool, and more likely that we will be able to yield accurate results. Now let's talk about data analysis and interpretation. So researchers should not just be interested in whether minority groups differ from the majority group. So this would be between group comparisons. So we often see in research studies where researchers will compare minority groups to majority groups. And this is what we call between group comparisons. So if we want to be culturally competent in our approach to research, then we would want to avoid minority, majority, or between group comparisons and focus more on minority or within group comparisons. Minority groups are not homogeneous or are not monolithic. So despite what we may think, there's a lot of variation even within certain minority groups. For example, within the African American community, there's a great deal of variation. Even within that group, or within the Hispanic community, there's a great deal of variation even within the Asian community, right? So no matter what group you look at, there's a lot of variability within that group. And that's something that we need to better understand. Instead of focusing so much on between group comparisons, we really need to be looking more at within group comparisons, and really avoiding this, the tendency to sort of lump everyone within a particular racial ethnic group into one category, and understanding that there's a great deal of heterogeneity even within these groups. We also want to avoid focusing too much on deficits and too little on strengths. And so we know that every racial ethnic group, every community has strengths. And so we don't want to spend too much time on being too hyper-focused or preoccupied on what is wrong with a particular group or community. We also want to understand what is right and what the strengths are of that community as well. We also want to avoid making false generalizations about minority populations when they are not adequately represented in studies. So again, we talked about this earlier, and how we really want to be careful to not overgeneralize or to make any false generalizations. So we always want to think about to what extent a particular group is represented. And when we look at that, when we see proportionately how groups are represented within a given study, then that gives us an idea of how to draw the correct generalizations based on who was included in the study and who was excluded. We also want to consider socioeconomic and structural factors in analyses. So this is kind of what we were talking about when we were discussing the issue of decontextualized data. And so anytime that we're studying racial ethnic minority groups, we want to always take into consideration structural factors, because we know that there are various different factors within the structures of society that often shape the experiences of minority and racial minority and oppressed groups. And so we don't want to ignore these structural factors as if they don't exist. We want to account for those structural factors in understanding how they shape the human experience for certain groups. And so we definitely, in our analysis and interpretation of data, we want to be sure that we account for those factors as well. And so as it relates to data analysis and interpretation, I also wanted to discuss what Dr. Ivory Tolson refers to as a Du Boisian framework. And he talks about this Du Boisian framework in relation to achieving equity in education. But I also think that this framework applies to research in general. And it really gives a good guide for how we can exercise cultural competency from data analysis all the way through interpretation. And so what he's essentially saying here in this figure, this model that he's created, is that first of all, we need good data. So we need good quality data to begin with. And he gives some sources of good quality data that he has used in his own work. And then from that data, we need thoughtful analysis. So again, as I just mentioned, a part of engaging in thoughtful analysis is not just looking at between group, but also within group analyses. We also need thoughtful comparisons between groups. And so if we're going to engage in between group comparisons, we need to do so thoughtfully. And also, and we need to have a sort of a rationale or reason for why we're engaging in these between group comparisons. There needs to be a reason for it, and it needs to be thoughtful, and we need to go about it in a way that is thoughtful. We also need to think about growth indicators. So as many of you may have seen in the literature, as you have worked on for your panel presentations, as you worked on this project, many of you may have seen that there's sort of an overemphasis on risk factors and not enough of an emphasis on protective factors. And so we need more indicators of growth and of protective factors to help us to better understand solutions. Because if we're so focused on risk factors, that sort of turns our attention in the direction of problems, but then it leaves us guessing in terms of what to do in terms of solutions. So we need more indicators of growth and more strengths-based analyses in terms of how we approach data analysis and interpretation. And finally, once we've engaged in thoughtful analyses, we need compassionate understanding. And so, it really is all about how we as researchers choose to interpret the data that we collect and that we analyze. So we not only need good data and we not only need thoughtful analyses, but then compassionate understanding speaks to how we interpret the data. And so how do we understand the data and how do we convey that understanding? And so we need compassionate understanding that is holistic, that is humanistic. So the humanistic piece kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of mixed methods approaches, where mixed methods helps us to see the human behind the numbers. And so we need more humanistic understanding. We need more understanding that is culturally aware, that is empathetic, and that is justice oriented. So I think really what he's getting at here is that beyond just having good data, we need to use that data and analyze that data in a way that is thoughtful. And then once we have analyzed that data in a thoughtful manner, then from there, in terms of interpreting, we need to exercise compassionate understanding. So all three of these components or elements go hand in hand. And so he refers to this in the book here on the left as a Du Boisian framework. And again, in this book, he comes from Dr. Ivory Tolson is a faculty member in the School of Education at Howard University. And so he really comes at this from the lens of education. But again, I think that it applies to the research process in general. And I think it is also very consistent with the social work profession as well and our values also. And so I wanted to share this framework with you as well. Now let's discuss acculturation. So researchers should also consider the immigration experience and acculturation factors and acculturation as factors to include in their research. So aside from structural factors that we should consider, we should also think about issues of acculturation. For example, Latinos or Asians who recently immigrated to the US are likely to have different needs and problems, different attitudes about child rearing or marital roles, and respond to social services differently than Latinos or Asians whose parents or grandparents have lived in the US for several decades longer. So the idea is that the longer one is in the US, the more likely they are to acculturate. And so we really want to understand in our work as well to what extent acculturation might influence the experiences of certain groups as well. So this is another factor that we want to take into consideration as we engage in more culturally competent research. Now let's look at some general strategies for developing cultural competence in research. So one of the first things that we want to do before we go out into the field to engage in data, we want to be sure that we are well read on the cultural group we are studying. For example, how we want to know things if we're engaging in research with Native Americans, we want to know how they feel about the loss of their ancestral lands. Or if we are engaging in research with African Americans, we want to understand how they feel about their mistreatment in scientific studies, which has led to feelings of distrust. So we really want to kind of have a good understanding of some of the major factors that might influence how certain groups have experienced their presence in the U.S. And in general, and also any experiences they may have had in research in the past as well, because there are certain groups that have been harmed by research in the U.S. And so we want to understand these things. And I just remember doing a lot of reading on non-resident African-American fathers before actually going out into the field to engage with them. And I have to say that it was very eye-opening. There were some things that I read about that were not necessarily true for me in my work, but it was still instructional and still informative for me to read about some of the challenges. I read a lot about some of the challenges that that researchers have experienced in the past with recruiting non-resident African-American fathers into research studies. However, I didn't necessarily have that same problem. I found when I went out to recruit that I didn't have as difficult of a time. And I found the individuals that I worked with in my study to be very open and welcoming of the opportunity to take part in my study. But it was still good to know, and it was still it was still instructional for me to just be aware of. And so we want to be aware of some of the nuances and idiosyncrasies that exist for certain groups of individuals, so that we are just that much more aware as we go out into the field, and we can be more prepared to engage with our population as we engage in the research process. We also want to avoid ethnocentrism, which is the belief in superiority of one's own culture. So we want to consider the traditions and values of those that we are studying. And in addition to that, we also want to be aware of how our own attitudes are connected to our cultural background and how this may differ from the worldview of those we are studying. Because we all come to this process with a worldview. Our participants have a worldview and we have a worldview. And we want to understand how those worldviews intersect and how that might influence the research process. So we want to be aware of these things as well. We want to also use participant observation and focus group methods of data collection as much as possible. This may not always be possible, but these are methods that allow us to connect with our with the community that much more. So it allows us to ultimately, if at all possible, we want to be able to immerse ourselves in the community through direct observation and use focus groups to learn how community members view issues relevant to our study. So one of the things that I did, which was similar to direct observation, even though that wasn't the purpose of my study, I didn't set out to do direct observation. But one of the things that I did was, before I collected any data with my participants, I would just go. They had groups every week with fathers at this one particular agency where I got most of my data. They had groups every week with fathers, and I would just go, and they would have dinner. They would offer dinner to all the participants every week, and I would just go and have dinner with them. And I went for several weeks, and after a while, they knew me. They got to know me. I observed their interactions as they interacted with the staff persons in the agency. And I just observed them, and I became a part of the group. They just got used to seeing me week after week after week. And so by the time I got ready to actually administer my survey, they were very open to taking part and very enthusiastic even in taking part in my study. And so I think this is a part of what your text is sort of getting at, is just this need to immerse ourselves in the community that we're studying. Also engage community members where possible. If community members include community members in the formulation of research questions and in all subsequent stages of the research process. So I have to say, I didn't actually do this in some of the earlier work that I did in the Baltimore area. I didn't actually engage community members, but I did engage leaders within the organizations and agencies that I was collecting data in terms of helping me to shape the questions that I was asking, particularly the qualitative questions. When I went in to do interviews with the participants, I did seek out the opinion and insight of agency leaders in helping me to formulate my interview questions. I wanted to make sure that the questions that I was asking were relevant. And so that's one thing we can do as well to try to engage the community on some level. And finally, seek the advice of professional colleagues. So seek help from colleagues who are members of the culture and who have a great deal of experience in working with its members. So this is just one additional thing that we can do to try to increase the cultural competency of the research process as much as possible. And so now let's talk a little bit about Malays's culturally competent scholarship framework. And so as this slide says, I like to go beyond the text. And as I mentioned earlier, I like to try to give you some nuggets of information that go beyond what is in your text from time to time, just to give a little bit more variety and to expose you to some new ideas and concepts that you probably may not otherwise have been exposed to. So here are the 8 criteria for culturally competent scholarship according to Malays. And as I read a couple of days ago, I found in an article a statement that this is probably one of the only, if not the only, framework that is out there that actually talks about cultural competency within the context of scholarship and research. And so this is the reason why I wanted to bring this into our discussion, is that we often think about cultural competency in practice, but not so much in scholarship and research. And so I think that this particular piece of work here is very, very important as we think about what cultural competency looks like in a research context. And so some of the criteria include contextuality, relevance, communication style, awareness of identity and power differences, disclosure, reciprocation, empowerment, and time. And so in terms of contextuality, we kind of touched on this earlier, but understanding the social, cultural, political, and historical context of study participants. So we know the importance of context. And so we always want to seek to understand the context of the participants that we're studying. And again, the relevance, we talked about this before too. So formulating research questions that address issues faced by the study population that are of direct relevance to them. Reciprocation, we talked about this as well. So conducting research that meets mutual goals and objectives of the researcher and the study population. So being sure that mutual goals are being met. Empowerment, carrying out a research process that contributes to empowering the community or the study population. And then also disclosure, avoidance of secrecy and building trust with the study population. So as you just heard me mention, going and having dinner with these participants, with my participants, although that might seem like a small thing, that's a big thing in terms of building trust, right? And so, and rapport. And so that's one of the things that I was doing without really knowing I was doing it at the time. But as I think back on it in hindsight, I realized how huge such a small thing was for building trust and rapport. And so this is very, very important, particularly with minority and oppressed populations. So these are just some of the things that are discussed in Malays's article. And again, I think this is such a valuable piece of work because it helps us to understand what cultural competency should look like in research and scholarship contexts. And so here is just another look at this particular framework, but by methodological area in terms of when we think about measurement, how we go about measuring concepts within studies with minority and oppressed populations. We want to make sure that that we consider the amount of time that it takes to complete our measurement tools. We consider communication style and language in our measurement tools. And also, when we think about formulating research problems, we think about issues of contextuality. We think about relevance in terms of the relevance of the research problem to the community. We also think about reciprocation. So when we are formulating research problem, we want to be thinking very early on about how studying this particular problem will benefit the community. And we also want to be thinking about how studying this problem will empower the community in the end. Getting the answers to the research questions that we're asking, how does getting that answer empower the community? And then also we want to think about dissemination of our findings. So how might disseminating the findings from our study empower the community? And how does that dissemination, in what ways is that dissemination of information reciprocal? Not only is the researcher getting to disseminate that information, but the community members are also having a say in how that the findings of that research get disseminated as well. So thinking about the reciprocation aspect, even in terms of how we disseminate the findings from our study. And then finally, recruitment and retention. So thinking about communication styles, when we're communicating about our study and making efforts to recruit and retain participants, we want to think about how we're communicating with them and whether or to what extent we're communicating with them in a way that is relevant to them, in a way that they are comfortable with. And then we also want to think about power differences, right? So oftentimes when we approach participants in our research studies about taking part in the study, there is a power dynamic there. And so we want to be very aware of that, because when individuals hear, I'm a researcher from Baylor University, they automatically think of you as being in a position of power. And so we want to have a sense of awareness about that as well. So these are just some of the things that that we would need to think about as it relates to cultural competency within the context of research. And then there's one research methodology that comes to mind in terms of its ability to help us foster cultural competency in research, and that is the community-based participatory research methodology. So community-based participatory research is a partnership approach to research that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, researchers, and others in all aspects of the research process, with all partners in the process contributing expertise and sharing in the decision-making and ownership. The aim of CBPR is to increase knowledge and understanding of a given phenomenon and to integrate the knowledge gained with the interventions for policy or social changes in ways that benefit community members. So in other words, community-based participatory research is a way in which we can involve community members in the research process from the beginning phases, where we are formulating research questions and research problems, all the way through findings, developing the findings from our study and disseminating those findings. And so this is a particular methodology in which it provides a very clear way of how to go about engaging community members in the research process in ways that benefit them. And so I'm not going to say much about this. We can talk more about CBPR in class, but again, this is something that I wanted to share with you that goes beyond your text and helps you to understand a concrete methodology as we talk about the importance of engaging community members. It begs the question of, well, how do we do that? How do we go about engaging community members? And so this particular model of research helps us to understand how to go about doing this. And so there's a whole body of literature on CBPR that provides a lot of directive and understanding of how to involve community. So we know that it's important to do it, but CVPR and those who've done the work in this area, it provides some clear direction in terms of how to do it, not just that we need to, but how to do it. Okay, and so we can talk about CVPR in class as well. And so here are some of the principles of CVPR, and I don't want to, or I won't read through this in detail rather, but in your own time, take a moment to just look over the principles that are associated with CVPR as well, just to get a bit more of an understanding of exactly what it is and what some of the underlying principles of this approach to research are. And then here's a video that also provides a bit more insight on exactly what CVPR is. There's a researcher here, Mark Wieland, who talks about working with CVPR. And so I think this helps to provide a bit more insight on this approach to research as well. Now we will end our discussion by talking about data justice, data governance, and decolonizing data. So as we talk about this topic of decolonizing data, I really wanted to put a spotlight on this Indigenous scholar, Abigail Echo Hawk. I came across her work this summer, and I attended a talk with her where she talked about the importance of decolonizing data. Abigail Echo Hawk is the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute and the chief research officer of the Seattle Indian Health Board. And much of her work focuses on decolonizing data by creating programs and databases that are not based on Western concepts to better serve Indigenous communities. And so here are a couple of quotes that I pulled from an article that was recently written in which she was interviewed in this article. And the title of the article is called Abigail Echo Hawk on the Art and Science of Decolonizing Data. And so here in the red, you'll see sort of how she's defining what it means to decolonize data. And so she says decolonizing data means that the community itself is the one determining what is the information they want us to gather. Why are we gathering it? Who's interpreting it? And are we interpreting it in a way that truly serves our communities? Decolonizing data is about controlling our own story and making decisions based on what is best for our people. And so we kind of talked about this previously in terms of the importance of really considering who gets to decide what is measured and how it is measured and who's included in any given study. And so a part of what it means to decolonize data is to give the ownership of the data to the community and allow the community to have voice in how the story is told. Because when we think about data, data tells a story, as she says here below in the next quote. She says, I always think about the data as a story and each person who contributed to that data as storytellers. What is our responsibility to the story and our responsibility to the storyteller? Those are all Indigenous concepts that we always care for our storytellers and we always have responsibility to our stories. So as researchers, we do have a responsibility to consider the story that we are telling with our data and who gets to tell the story and who does the data belong to, right? And so ultimately, whoever the data belongs to is ultimately the individuals who end up getting the opportunity to tell the story with the data and to have control of the narrative. And so, and as she says above here, she talks about how oftentimes data are gathered in such a way, particularly with marginalized communities, data are gathered in such a way oftentimes that just doesn't help or serve certain communities. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the data collection process is done in such a way that it shines more of a light on the deficits within communities rather than the strengths. And so, oftentimes we talk about what's wrong with a particular community, and we talk about the risk factors and the high rates of obesity or the high rates of diabetes or the high rates of infant mortality, but we forget to think about or discuss the strengths of the community and the fact that although, yes, there might be high rates of certain diseases within particular communities, but we also have to think about what those communities have endured and the fact that they have been resilient enough to withstand sometimes efforts to really annihilate their community. And so we really have to think about not only the deficits within communities, but also the strengths. And when the members of the community have the ability to control the data and how it's collected and the story that gets told, then that story is told in a way that truly honors the community. And so much of the way, and we don't often talk about this, but so much of the way in which we go about collecting data within the US context is a very westernized way of going about the data collection process, and not necessarily a way in which the community themselves would go about collecting data. Oftentimes when we collect data using surveys in particular, it's more about going into the community, collecting the data and leaving the community without ever having sought their input or opinion at all. And so, we really have to think about this and think about how data are collected. And again, who gets to control the narrative. And so that really is what underlies this whole idea of decolonizing data. And so I welcome you to take a look at this article that is written with Abigail Echo-Hawk. I also welcome you to visit the website that I offered for the Urban Indian Health Institute, where she is in leadership there, to learn more about her efforts to decolonize data and to take control of the stories that are told about the community that she represents, which is the Native American and Alaska Native community. And here's a video on data justice. Again, I mentioned that I attended a talk with her and a couple of other individuals over the summer. And so this is the talk that I attended. And so you can see Abigail Echo-Hawk right here down in the right-hand corner of the screen. And so she's the main speaker, as well as the woman that is on the bottom left-hand corner as well. So they were the two main speakers in the video. And so I welcome you and encourage you to take a look at this talk when you get a chance, as she kind of breaks down this whole idea and notion of what it means to decolonize data and what her stance is on this. So I think that it'll help you to have a bit of a better insight on this concept or idea of data governance, data justice, and data decolonization. So in summary, in this video lecture, we have discussed cultural competency in research versus practice context, 4 key features of culturally competent research, general strategies for developing cultural competency in research, Malays's 8 criteria for culturally competent scholarship, a research methodology for fostering cultural competency in research, specifically community-based participatory research. And finally, we discuss issues in research related to data governance, data justice, and decolonizing data. So now is the time at which I invite you to check for your understanding of these concepts. You can do this in one of 3 ways: by completing the form on the left and clicking submit, or copying and pasting the link in your browser, or scanning the QR code with your cell phone. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.